Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
We're joined once again by Christian Rivera from the Dopamine Podcast. Christian, welcome back.
Thanks for having me. Always a pleasure.
And this is the fourth and final in this series that you have helped us talk about, Christian, which is on the topic of using your sixth function to disrupt a cognitive function loop. That is a mouthful. If this is your first podcast, welcome. And also, go get some context because the first three will give you plenty of information to go with on the subject, which is a little bit more of an intermediate subject for those of you who are into personality types. Now, we're talking about cognitive functions, so if you've never heard of those, please go check out the Car Model podcast. If you want to hear more information on cognitive function loops, we've done podcasts on that. And if you want to understand what the sixth function is, we recently recorded a podcast on developing all 8 of your cognitive functions, which would, of course, include the 4 shadow functions, which are not in your Car Model. So let's pretend, though, you're up to speed. Let's pretend you know exactly what we're talking about because you have listened to the previous 3 podcasts on using that sixth function. We will be wrapping it up with the feeling functions as our fourth and final conversation on this topic. Now, the feeling functions of introverted feeling and extroverted feeling would be the second/sixth functions for IFJs, ISFJs and INFJs, and EFPs, ESFPs and ENFPs.
So for IFJs, ISFJs, or INFJs, you may have heard of this concept of the cognitive loop. And the cognitive loop is when you get into a loop of your dominant function and your 10-year-old tertiary function. Your dominant function could be either introverted sensing or introverted intuition, depending on if you're an INFJ or ISFJ. And the tertiary 10-year-old is introverted thinking. And they both share the same attitude. That means you're staying in your own internal, subjective, personal world. And you're skipping over the secondary function. And it's really easy to skip over this secondary function because as an introvert, and I'm an introvert myself, I'm an INTP, I know that it is very easy to want to stay into that introverted world. And staying there is more comfortable. And it is just it's a more cozy place for you. It's somewhere that you'll do everything you can to stay there. I do the same thing at times. And so if you're using your introverted intuition or sensing and your introverted thinking, you're bypassing that secondary parent, that co-pilot in the car model. So what's important for you is that secondary function is an important part of your genius zone. It is what really allows you to tap into your genius of who you are and your energy and how you bring your best to the world. So this tertiary function, while it can feel really great, it can feel like you've had this parent-child relationship, this single parent and child relationship with the dominant and 10-year-old, and then this new parent comes in and it's a little bit uncomfortable. So you can think of it over in the short term in this loop. Maybe something's happened and you're staying in this place and you need a way to start to jumpstart and get into this secondary function of extroverted feeling.
So introverted thinking, right, exactly. So extroverted feeling, of course, is about getting people's needs met. It's about connecting with other people, particularly emotionally, and getting sort of into rapport and focusing on relationships. When an IFJ bypasses that or uses that function in service of their 10-year-old or tertiary, this is the loop. And that 10-year-old or tertiary for an IFJ is introverted thinking. Now, introverted thinking, we call it accuracy. And those of us that are TPs that use it, we use it really to depersonalize. We're trying to get space from other people so we can think clearly. But when it's being used as a loop, right, a defensive strategy to avoid the relationships that extroverted feeling, that other, as you mentioned, Christian, that other parent, when it's used to bypass that or maybe even full out ignore it, oftentimes it goes to a critical place, a hypercritical. Now, that can be hypercritical of yourself with perfectionism, or it can be hypercritical of others and being basically kind of catty. It's judging people on not performing well enough with social expectations. So that cattiness can look like the values in your mind are how people are supposed to show up, right? Built on a lifetime of observing social dynamics. A person is not behaving that way, and so you start to kind of pick them apart. And then you can also do that to yourself. You can turn that same introverted thinking criticism in on yourself that you're not doing enough, you're not being good enough. So the perfectionism can either be of yourself or other people. So the sixth function, that's for you as an IFJ, introverted feeling or authenticity. This is a function that understands that each person is a unique individual. Everybody has their own story, they have their own narrative, they have their own feelings, they have their own experience. And in that experience, a lot of different behaviors, a lot of different basically feelings about the world and value structures are valid. Introverted feeling is about validating everybody's individual subjective human experience. And by doing that, sometimes people will show up in a way that doesn't have a natural fit in the rest of society. Sometimes we kind of have to carve our place in society, that social structures don't make space for everybody's individualism. When an IFJ is too much in their loop, that introverted thinking critical place doesn't make space for people's uniqueness. It doesn't make space for individuality or even individual experiences, including your own, right? Like you might have a weird day. You might just not be performing. You're not showing up the way that, in a way that's like has utility or makes you a part of the social spectrum. You're just showing up as yourself. Maybe you're having an off day. Maybe you're depressed. Maybe you're going through something. When an IFJ is caught in a loop, but then uses that sixth function as sort of like you mentioned, Christian, jumper cables, it reminds the IFJ that people are going through things. They're having a moment, and that might be okay. It helps validate the experience that a person might be going through to just remind the IFJ, maybe I'm going through something. Maybe I am just kind of having a moment. Maybe I need to not be so harsh on myself. Or maybe somebody else is having a moment and they might not need my criticism. Maybe they need me to hold a little bit of space for them.
Sometimes the tertiary function of introverted thinking in an ISFJ or INFJ can have this protective place. It's where extroverted feeling is about building harmony and building rapport. Introverted thinking is sometimes about breaking rapport. And sometimes this is a place of, INFJs, even though extroverted feeling is a function in the stack, it's not always about bringing the entire world into your space. Sometimes introverted thinking is used as a mechanism to create a boundary. It's like checking if you're cool to handle my directness, to handle my truth. And that if misused, that tertiary introverted thinking can make the criteria for getting into my world so tight that it does not allow anyone to get in. Anyone that is a little bit different than what your idealism or your expectation is, they will not be allowed to get in. And this sixth function introverted feeling broadens the criteria to understand that everybody's got uniqueness. And this uniqueness is new for you to experience. This is something that needs to be accepted and validated in all sorts of people that you come across in life.
There is a little resistance that IFJs have to introverted feeling. And there's some resistance that EFPs have to extroverted feeling, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. And we kind of mentioned this in actually previous podcasts. The instinctive resistances that we have to these six functions. I don't think we mentioned as much in the thinking podcast, even though there is definitely resistances to those, those opposite attitude thinking functions as well. But I think it shows up the most obvious in the feeling functions. Like this is where it really showcases our resistances. And for IFJs, the resistance they have to introverted feeling is it feels selfish. Right? Like you're not supposed to be doing that. Like you're not supposed to be all about your experience and what's going on for you. So when an IFJ makes space for this function, even if they're not developing it, if they make a little bit of space for this function, it gives them some permission to be a little selfish. They don't have to criticize themselves for going through what they're going through. And it also helps them give space to other people to be a little bit selfish, because all of us need that. We all need that. We need a moment of selfishness. We need a moment to attend to ourselves. When the IFJ gives themselves some space, right? Because then again, that sixth function allows you to stay in inner terrain, which is what the loop is really focused on, is staying in that introverted attitude for IFJs. That's what the loop is all about. I don't want to go outside. It allows you to stay in that inner terrain, but opens up the frame to get personal again. Just like you mentioned, Christian, introverted thinking is depersonalized. It's cold. It's detached on purpose. This connects back to the personal element. It gets you back into a feeling space. And when you get into that feeling space and you repersonalize things, you remember, you get back to humanizing. Then your natural wiring is going to want to kick that humanizing up into your second function of extroverted feeling, because that's your native language. That's your native feeling language. So when you give people and yourself a little bit of space for going what they're going through, having a moment of selfishness, and then it kicks up into extroverted feeling, now it goes back into like, well, how do I connect with people? How do I think of them in terms of compassion as opposed to seeing them in terms of criticism?
So I think the principle here that we're talking about is individuation. And as an IFJ, you individuate in some ways about what your thoughts are, what you think and your beliefs are in your 10-year-old or tertiary of introverted thinking. And what we're saying is now also individuate your identity level. So who am I as my essence, my personhood, my individual nature of myself for yourself first, and then it also allows you to extend that to others for their individual nature. But it's about individuation. You're using the individuation of your thoughts to pivot over to get to your individuation of your identity level.
And I think what's important to know is that it's not always going to be convenient to have those kinds of feelings. It's not going to be like this scheduled thing where everyone gets to share their emotions when it's the appropriate time to share your emotions. You might have to just share your raw emotion with yourself in the mirror when it comes. And that's going to be getting to something that we're going to share with you what the hack is in a second. But understanding that you can't always schedule this expression of your feelings. And sometimes you just have to let it go in order to jumpstart getting into that place.
Right. And other people can't either sometimes.
Yes.
It's just emergent. Understanding that emotions and feelings and the inner things that motivate us are emergent cuts ourselves and other people a little bit of slack. And I think when an IFJ allows that, just that understanding and awareness, right? Just not reading into the intentions of other people, but kind of holding space for what their intent and motivations might really be outside of our projection, right? And just kind of holding space for that. Again, the IFJ will naturally want to kick that into extroverted feeling, and then they'll get back into a personalized way where they're like showing compassion again. They're humanizing other people, and they'll want to get back into relationship. And I think this idea of, again, there's two ideas. There's the hack that gets you into your second function. And then once you've developed your first and second function, now you have some space to revisit that sixth function. And the way it usually looks like in a long-term development is understanding your own personal values. Being willing to create personal values that are outside of societal expectations. But that only happens once you've done a good job at disconnecting from long-term loops and really developing that second function.
So to access this hack, what I recommend you do is to take a moment, slow everything down, look into the mirror, and tell yourself some of the criticisms that you're telling yourself or you're telling others, and notice the changes in your body, in your facial expressions. And basically, this is a way for you to humanize yourself and the thoughts that you're having, and to think about how this feels for you when it's happening. All of these judgments, these criticisms that you're having for yourself, catalog those moments in your body. Feel what it feels like to feel this emotion and where it comes up in your body. Your heart is pumping really fast, or maybe you're sweating a little bit, or you're just physically uncomfortable. Catalog those feelings, and I'm sure there are other ways to do this, but there are a multitude of intense feelings. I'm not an introverted feeler, so I don't have all of those those minute nuances, but catalog how that shows up for you.
On top of that, I think that that's the best exercise you can do, particularly if you're being critical of others. If you're being critical of the self, there might be some unprocessed emotions. So one of the things you can do as well is to get into like playlists of emotional expression to allow you to access some of those emotions that you might be avoiding. If there's criticism, what lives under the criticism? Is it disappointment in the self? Is it sadness? Is it grief? Or do you have some anger going on? Are you mad and resentful? Or are you afraid? Do you have anxiety that you're not performing well enough? Identify what the emotions that live under your self-criticism are, and then design like songs or playlists that help you get into that emotional expression, and then just get some of those emotions pumping through you so that you can cycle them through. and then wash them out and be able to return back into a place of connecting with others.
Introverted feelings all occupied with this notion of what motivates me. What is the motivation behind the thing that I do? And so when you're doing what Antonia suggests, to ask, what's underneath, the emotion underneath, what you're actually saying is, what is the root motivation of why I feel this way, or why I'm having this criticism, either of the self or someone else? Why am I criticizing that other person over there that's taking this action? What's my motivation to be critical toward them? What does that say about how I'm being motivated toward that? That's really getting straight into that introverted feeling authenticity process to find out why you do what you do.
And this sixth function of introverted feeling authenticity is it's an access point back to an extroverted feeling, as we've said. And that extroverted feeling is starting to accept more people in your world. Again, you may have used that introverted thinking function to constantly push people away. So this allows you to start to understand more motivations and access people in your life more openly. And this can happen slowly over time. This is a hack that you use in the moment when you're looping. And then you can start to use this repetitively as a tool to build this strength over time to accept more people into your world, more motivations, more concepts, more ideas from more people, and surround yourself with a beautiful array of human beings.
And once you've got that second function really robust, right, you've really flexed that muscle, one of the benefits that the development of the sixth function gives you over time, not as an immediate moment hack to get, to disrupt the loop, but once you really get into development of it, now you start getting into like building a relationship with yourself, building a relationship and understanding your identity. And as Joel mentioned, what motivates you? What is underneath all of that? Who are you underneath all of it? And so you get a real relationship with yourself, not just understanding who you are as reflected by others in your relationship group. So this sixth function is very powerful for IFJs.
We will be right back. If you're focused on personal growth, I think you'll resonate with our core content over at personalityhacker.com. We want to see you understand how your mind is wired so you can generate motivation, improve social skills, find career opportunities, and master excellent decision making. But a quick warning, we are advice and action focused in all of our articles, podcasts, and videos. This means that we attract people who like to be challenged to become excellent, to take action, to put in the work to optimize themselves, not simply just gather more information. If you are committed to personal growth and ready to radically find your inner truth, then come over and be a part of our growing community of like minds at Personality Hacker. Now back to the show.
Now let's move on to the feeling functions for EFPs.
EFPs, ESFPs, and ENFPs are going to be using a driver or dominant function of either extroverted intuition, exploration for ENFPs, or extroverted sensation for ESFPs. And this means that their co-pilot is the same. It's introverted feeling, that authenticity process that's really gives them a lot of rounds out their personality basically to make better decisions based on what's personally resonant, core values, core motivations. It's a great place to be. But what happens with EFPs is they tend to skip past that introverted feeling authenticity process and they go to that 10-year-old tertiary. They get in a loop of extroverted thinking effectiveness of what works, what gets the job done, what gets the impact I want right now or very soon. And they have a tendency just to stay away from checking in with their own values and take action in the outer world. And this can be a challenge. So what we're talking about here is going to the sixth function, which would be the opposite attitude of introverted feeling, which would be extroverted feeling or harmony. And how can harmony be used as a hack to temporarily disrupt that loop and push us as EFPs up into that co-pilot auxiliary process?
So what I think is really interesting about this entire series, you may have noticed a pattern up to this point where there's relationships between these functions. We have the feeling functions working together, and we're going to extrapolate on that as we finish the EFPs. But you'll notice if you haven't listened to the other functions yet, particularly IFJ, I would recommend listening to that first and coming back to here as well, because you're going to be using extroverted feeling, which IFJs use, and EFPs are going to be using that secondary function of introverted feeling, which IFJs are going to be accessing for their sixth function. So there's a relationship here that I think is important to to not just listen to your type, but go listen to other people's. That's just a side note. So as Joel mentioned, that skipping the secondary function of introverted feeling is going to get the EFP into a place of possibly dehumanizing the people that they're working with and being impersonal to accomplish a goal, being so goal-oriented that they will bulldoze and get through anything they need to get the thing done, regardless of who it affects or how it affects anyone, and even not checking in with your own personal motivations.
And I think, as with all the loops, and I'm not sure if we made this super clear on every type, but one of the challenges with the loop is that it's not that we don't use that auxiliary function or secondary function at all. We're using it in service of the 10-year-old or tertiary function. So we're avoiding it except for when it's useful for us. Kind of like when we talked about IFJs being critical of other people. Well, what are they criticizing? They're criticizing that the other person's not showing up as socially acceptable, right? And so that's enough extroverted feeling, but it's being used in service of the criticism of introverted thinking. What happens with EFPs when they're in a loop is that they're using their understanding of introverted feeling or what motivates people.
Great point.
In order to manipulate them into getting what they want accomplished. And so it's not just that they're bulldozing. I mean, we talked about like ETJ or ENJs or ESJs, like bulldozing sometimes. This isn't just bulldozing. This is active manipulation of other people.
Well, knowing somebody's motivations so well that you can manipulate their motivational structure to get what you want.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Yeah, it's a really good calibration point.
Yeah, well, and it's and what I've also noticed is EFPs will use that understanding of motivations to trick themselves into believing that they have good motivations when they don't, because they can find that motivation. So they're manipulating other people and manipulating themselves into getting what they want, and that's one of the worst components of a loop. Is kind of it's really it's conning. It's conning the self and others in order to get what you want. So this makes it a little easier to see how that sixth function of extroverted feeling can really be in service to disrupting this loop, because extroverted feeling is about checking in with the emotional temperature of other people. It's about checking in with how other people, like how you're making other people feel and the rapport going back and forth. It infuses some compassion into this dynamic. And so that sixth function can disrupt the loop of maybe high manipulation to get what you want, to get your ends met, by reminding you that these are people and they have feelings. They don't just have motivations and intents to be manipulated. These are like people who might be reflecting back that juju you're putting out, that energy you're putting out, by reflecting it back to you because you're now in rapport with somebody and now you're feeling the energetic, emotional back and forth. And now you're going, oh, this kind of feels icky, this energy that I'm putting out to somebody else, because I'm getting it back while I'm in extroverted feeling. So this sixth function can be very helpful in disrupting that loop by infusing some of that mirroring back in real time how you're making the person feel, or how this is going to potentially damage the relationship once they realize what's going on.
And I imagine this space can feel very uncomfortable, because for a moment it feels like you have to betray yourself. You have to make this motivational moment change, this most motivational change in essence of what you've decided to do. You've made an action based on a decision for your internal decision. Now you're deciding to make a choice and do something, and you're going and making these things happen. So to take other people's feelings into consideration feels odd. It feels alien. It feels a little bit strange. And there's one of the phrases that I think is a very extroverted feeling phrase. It's read the room. Taking that moment to stop what you're doing and read the room. Look at people's faces. See how they're reacting to the situation. If you're in that type of situation, to be able to check in or even literally ask, how are you feeling about this? Does this make sense?
Yeah. Well, and also if the person is, if you're doing a good enough job as an EFP, the other person might not know what's going on while it's happening. So the other thing that you can infuse into it is how, when they figure this out, or if they do, how is this going to impact our rapport or our relationship, if you actually have a relationship with the person? Or how is this going to make them feel later, right? Like if I was there at the moment that they realized what happened, how would I feel? Like how it's really kind of employing that golden rule principle. And so extroverted feeling is a great tool of disruption because it reminds you to not just be in your experience and not just be true to yourself, but also be in integrity with relationships, be in integrity with how you're treating other people and knowing how it's going to make them feel, even if, like you said, there might be some resistance to this because you don't want to betray yourself. You don't want to just do things because other people want you to do them. You don't want to be living for others. One of the beautiful things about introverted feeling is that it understands that it wants to honor itself. And I think that's what happens, just like with all of these functions, is that as an EFP, if you check in with that rapport, you check in with that sort of the emotional temperature back and forth and how it's going to make another person feel, when you get into compassion, as an EFP, your mind is going to want to kick the feeling up into your native feeling language of introverted feeling. And now you're going to think things like, how would this make me feel? How would I feel in the same situation if I was on the receiving end of this? What's my motivation and intent for doing this? Like what's going on underneath the surface? And it reminds you to get back into what's honest for you. Like what is sincere for you? Not just what you're trying to get, not just what you're trying to accomplish, but what's honest and what is in alignment with your morals, with your ethics, with your values, with who you want to be.
So one of the things you can do to actually start to access this extroverted feeling, and like we said with previous types, this is a short-term hack that you can use when you are in a loop, and then there's long-term versions of this. So what you can do in the moment when you are doing this kind of dehumanizing behavior, and you want to be able to adapt and take care of others and make sure their needs are met. The simple thing that you could do is send a text of encouragement to someone, starting with the phrase, or this is just a recommendation, but we recommend using the phrase, I appreciate you because, and just send a quick text. This is literally stop what you're doing, take a moment, send some appreciation to someone. Unwarranted, nothing you're getting out of it, just because you appreciate the person, you're trying to maintain the relationship and getting into a space of humanizing the person. That's the only goal, is taking a moment to humanize someone you care about.
Particularly, and you can do this if you don't have a relationship with the person that you're in the loop trying to, like if you're actively in a manipulation situation, you might want to turn that phrase on the person, like that you're realizing that you're manipulating.
Yeah.
Turn that phrase onto them. If that's not, if you're finding yourself in a long-term loop where this is sort of your MO, you're realizing this is what you do, then connecting, as you just mentioned, Christian, sending these texts to people, just kind of check in and like you said, feed a relationship, nourish it, and you don't get necessarily anything out of it. You're just giving nourishment to somebody else and encouragement. If you have the circumstances, and I'd like to hear from Joel because as an ENFP, I know he gets into TE tertiary moments. If you have the circumstances where you're just kind of in a bulldozing moment, right? You're just trying to get something done and you're like not really seeing people as people, but you're seeing them more as resources. If you have a loved one there, sometimes physical interaction like a hug or just being held can really throw you out of this mentality and into something with more compassion.
It resonates with me to do an active service for someone or to physically connect with you, maybe Antonia, if I'm having I can feel that loop starting to grip a hold of me and I need to get out of that as a hack. I think that there is something to be said for coming over and just, letting my guard down and it might even be you and I'm like, we got to do this thing. And I'm like trying to get you on board and move faster. And I might be using emotion to manipulate. And I'm like, wait a minute, that's going to cause damage. So let me create connection first and then we'll go back into the thing we're trying to accomplish. So I definitely resonate with what you're saying.
Go ahead. I think it makes sense that if you want to kickstart internal love, that external love is a great way to do that. That's the simplest way to think about this. Getting a hug from someone, or even just reminding someone in your life that, if I get into tell them, if I get into this kind of space, talk me down, offer me a hug, come help me make a sandwich for someone, or do something that gets me out of this and takes good care of me. Pull me aside, give me a hug.
Well, and this idea of using this to disrupt and then get back into introverted feeling, I mentioned it in kind of a high-minded way, which is what is my motivation and intent, and is this the kind of person I want to be? But oftentimes I've noticed that when EFPs do this, particularly if they're not like sociopaths, because that whole manipulation thing makes it sound very sociopathic. But I think when an EFP gets into extroverted thinking as a loop, oftentimes they have a need going unmet. They're stressed out, they're anxious, they're trying to make something happen, they're pushing, and it's because there's something actually missing in them and they just haven't gotten that need met. So sometimes connecting to extroverted feeling with somebody else, that reminds you, oh yeah, people have needs. I have needs. What is going missing for me? Maybe I should get my need met as well, because it puts you in need meeting mentality. And once you've connected with somebody else, then you can kick it up into introverted feeling and be like, well, maybe something's going on and I need to do some self-care, right? Like it could be, what's my motivation? What kind of person do I want to be? It could be that more high-minded. Or it could just be real simple, like maybe I'm like hungry, or maybe I'm stressed, or maybe I just need to like go do a meditation or do some yoga or something. And once you meet your need, now you're refreshed and then you're not in a loop anymore. The long term, of course, we've talked about this is a disruptive short term, but the long term benefits of extroverted feeling for ENFPs is better relationships. It's understanding that you can create an ecosystem where you can connect to how other people are reacting and responding to things. And so your messaging becomes a little bit more impactful and effective if you're trying to communicate to other people. It's not just things on your terms, it's understanding that there are things that legit make people cringe. And sometimes when you show up just throwing your individuality at everyone else, sometimes that doesn't really allow you to have the impact you want to have in the world. And so extroverted feeling helps season an EFP. It helps them get their messages across better, helps the relationships turn out a little bit better, and it just overall creates better sort of emotional and relationship hygiene.
If you've been following along, you've probably noticed a pattern of these functions in how they've shown up from the conversations. The first podcast, we talked about the sensing functions, ISPs, ESJs. If you notice, it brings a reality check to the ISP or ESJ. In episode 2, we talked about the intuitive functions, ENJs and INPs. This brings possibilities, meaning and implications to the ENJ or INP. The third show, the last episode, we talked about the thinking functions for ETPs and ITJs, and this helps depersonalize and create distance for these two types. And then in this episode, we talked about the feeling functions for EFPs and IFJs, and this is ultimately helping us rehumanize and reconnect to humanity through the functions and using that sixth as a hack.
So we hope that all 4 of these in this series has helped you figure out some strategies for getting out of a loop, some quick tips to break that cycle and help get you into your second or auxiliary cognitive function. And then, of course, as mentioned many times, once you have that nice and robust, that first and second function really working well, and as Christian's mentioned a couple of times, in your genius, then revisit that sixth function and use it to season your personality and to have a richer experience.
I want to be a little more emphatic with what you just said, because there's a temptation potentially to skip past your co-pilot auxiliary development because it could be exciting to maybe go and develop other things and get distracted. It is very important, and we want to reiterate this, that the 2 functions, your dominant driver, your co-pilot auxiliary, are very important to develop first. Because otherwise, like for me as an ENFP, as I'm thinking about this, if I didn't develop introverted feeling, authenticity first, and I try to access extroverted feeling, what's going to get people's needs met, what does the group need? Here again, as an EFP, I might be outsourcing my identity, I might be outsourcing my core values, I might be outsourcing myself to others. So I have to start with knowing where my core values lie and what actually resonates with me and my motivations on a core level. That's a personal example for me. You need to apply this to your personality type as well, because if you don't, you can totally get distracted off the course of development. So there's that hack with the sixth function. And then after you've really worked and developed yourself, that's where you go to after you do your dominant driver, your co-pilot auxiliary. You go to the sixth function for more nuanced development over time. I just want to make that really emphatic.
It's true, because we do bypassing all the time, don't we?
All the time.
We're always looking for a reason not to develop our auxiliary.
Yeah, we just want to skip steps constantly, and that's human.
Yeah.
I understand.
Well, and then we get really excited about new systems and new theories, and we're like, oh, 6 function, let's rush to there.
But you know what? Same for me. As an INTP, my extroverted intuition, I've done a lot of travel. I've traveled across the country twice, been to London and Paris. I've experienced a lot of things in life. And now I feel like I have a future possibility for myself. And I'm continuously creating future possibilities and visions. And I'm casting visions for myself all the time. And I don't feel stuck. I don't feel stuck so much anywhere near as I used to. So it's been this amazing process of focusing on my extroverted intuition, because then it's starting to be capped off by introverted intuition, and it really feels like a full experience.
Yeah, I think that sometimes we forget that our auxiliary function is the path of liberation, because it feels like so much work is wound up in that. And yet when we do it well and it's really well developed, we are so liberated from so many challenges and problems. And then all of the rest of it is seasoning. It's maturing. It's becoming better versions of ourselves. But man, that second function is super important. Christian, thank you so much for being a part of this series. You added so much to it.
Thank you so much. Genuinely, I think this episode is a banger. This whole series is fantastic. I'm biased, obviously, but we put a lot of work into this. I think this is really great. If you did enjoy it, I do genuinely hope you leave comments, like positive comments, that you did enjoy this and you've gained something from it. Because even in the process of making this, I also learned plenty.
Where can people follow more about you?
Dopamine.life, DOPEAMINE. I have my own podcast, articles, all of that fun stuff. And I'm also at Let's Go C Note on Twitter.
Right. And dopamine is spelled, you just spelled it, but it's spelled a little different than normal.
Yes, DOPE, like yo, that's dope.
Yo, that's dope. Amine.
Yes.
Right? AMINE.
It's terrible for SEO, but it's fine.
Yeah. It's branding, right?
It's fine.
And we hope that this is not the last time you come and co-host, because we had such a blast having you here.
If you've been following along, listening, what do you think? What's coming up for you? We want to hear from you. You're the fourth person here in this conversation. You haven't been a co-host of the mic, but you've been part of this discussion, and now it's time to make your voice heard. Come over to personalityhacker.com. Directly below this episode, leave a question, leave a comment. I guess ask a question, leave a comment. Or share your story, something personally that's coming up for you. Maybe you're in your journey right now of developing your co-pilot. You're learning about your sixth function, maybe how to weave that in, spice up your development process in your personality. Or maybe you've done a lot of development in your first two functions and now you're really digging into that sixth function. Or you're using it as a hack to be able to get out of that loop dynamic. We want to hear what's going on in your life. So come over to personalityhacker.com, make your voice heard.
And if you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. Leave a rating and review for us on iTunes. That helps us out a lot. I'm not just saying that, it really does. We have a book. It's called Personality Hacker. You can get it at all major book retailers. And if you leave us a rating and review on Amazon or on Goodreads, that also helps us out a lot. And of course, we are subsidized by our program suite at personalityhacker.com. If it is interesting to you, please come check out our suite of programs to see if it's a right decision to invest in you and in us with a personal growth program. So go check it out if that is interesting to you.
It will always be a right decision to invest in yourself.
That's right.
Just if you use these programs, that's the question. But investing in yourself is always a good option. And I think we do have great programs for you and your personality. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
I'm Christian Rivera.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we're going to talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast. If you're focused on personal growth, I think you'll resonate with our core content over at personalityhacker.com. We want to see you understand how your mind is wired so you can generate motivation, improve social skills, find career opportunities, and master excellent decision making. But a quick warning, we are advice and action focused in all of our articles, podcasts, and videos. This means that we attract people who like to be challenged to become excellent, to take action, to put in the work to optimize themselves, not simply just gather more information. If you are committed to personal growth and ready to radically find your inner truth, then come over and be a part of our growing community of like minds at Personality Hacker.